my channel. I'm quite excited today because I got some new clothes for my baby doll, and as you can see, doesn't she look so cute? Doesn't she look so cute? I got her some nice, she's wearing a nice little dress, and that is just so cute. It made me really happy. I just love dressing up dolls. It's like, I love dolls. Yeah, I love dolls. I just love dolls. I always have done. I like dolls, you know? So yeah, I just thought I'd show you that. She's in her new dress. She's in her new little dress. Isn't that cute? Yeah. So in today's video, just bring this over here. Ah, no, it fell down. Hang on, I'm just going to have to move. It's so annoying when that happens. Or is it to fall down? I'll put Constance and Ada there for now. Okay, don't fall down. Hang on. It's not the first time, it's not the last time. It always falls down. It's so annoying. Very typical indeed. Right, sorry about that. It's because it's annoying because I write all my notes in a folder, and all the paper is coming loose. It's not ideal. My dad got it for me. Normally I prefer writing in folders where the paper is a bit more firm, but it's all I've got, so has to do. It's just annoying. Anyway, in this video, I wanted to carry on talking about non-verbal learning disability, as I talked about in a previous video, because I rediscovered a website which I have been on before, but not for some time, called Non-Verbal Learning Disabilities Line, or NLD Line. It's quite an old website, but it's got some really good articles on there. And I thought that I will go through some of the articles, and this will take quite a number of videos because I'm just going to focus on one article per video. So it's going to take quite a number of videos, but I just thought it would be interesting, particularly as some of you might be interested to know more about non-verbal learning disabilities because they're not often talked about. And of course, now they've got rid of Asperger's syndrome and lumped everything into autism general, like a sort of wide autism spectrum. Obviously, it's a lot harder to carry out research, and I think that's rather a shame because we're not really going to get any further into understanding the difference between the various subtypes. So I found this article on NLD Line, written by someone called Bonnie Forrest, PhD. I think it's quite an old article, and it's talking about the boundaries between Asperger's syndrome and non-verbal learning disability. Assessing the boundaries between the two conditions. So she first of all makes the point that the non-verbal learning disability profile can be very similar to that of Asperger's syndrome. The main difference is the absence in non-verbal learning disabilities of restricted interest. I thought that was quite interesting. That seems to be the main difference between the two groups. And obviously I do have restricted interests, like historically really, really extreme restricted interests and obsessive interests and need for routine. And that's obviously why I got my autism diagnosis, or what would have been called Asperger's, you know. Back when I got diagnosed, it was all like Asperger's syndrome, because that was before they'd, changed it all to the wide autism spectrum. But it seems to be possible for someone to be diagnosed with non-verbal learning disability, certainly in America, where the concept is most often applied. It seems that it's possible for someone to be diagnosed with that who doesn't meet the criteria for Asperger's, who may be because they've got that neuropsychological profile, but they lack the restricted behaviours, interests and activities that is needed for an Asperger's or autism diagnosis alongside the social problems. So if someone just has the neuropsychological profile of non-verbal learning disability, including social difficulties, but they don't have restricted and repetitive behaviours, then they wouldn't be able to be diagnosed autistic. But obviously if someone does have restricted behaviours, interests and activities alongside all of those other conditions, then historically they would have been diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, as indeed I was. So obviously it is quite confusing, and there's so many different points of view on this. Like, some people think a non-verbal learning disability is basically just describing Asperger's syndrome, and that non-verbal learning disability is the neuropsychological profile of at least a subgroup of people with Asperger's syndrome, but focusing more on the sort of neuropsychological profile, what you get if you cognitively assess them. So in other words, I'm basically pretty classic Asperger's because I have that neuropsychological profile of non-verbal learning disabilities, plus all the other additional features that kind of give me a diagnosis of Asperger's historically. But obviously some people with Asperger's don't have that neuropsychological profile. So yeah, and there's a lot of kind of debate as to different subgroups. I personally think there are subgroups. I think that people with a neuropsychological profile of NVLD with Asperger's probably have a different cause to people who don't have that profile, and probably it is basically a very specific type of autism essentially. But now, because they've got rid of Asperger's, this is going to be increasingly hard to kind of unpick. And interestingly, as Bonnie Forrest says in this article, although one subgroup of children with non-verbal learning disability described by Johnson and Michaelbast in 1967 exhibits social difficulties or deficits, this group does not exhibit restricted interests. So it seems there is a group of children who have that neuropsychological profile of non-verbal learning disability alongside social deficits who don't have the restricted and repetitive behaviours required for an Asperger's diagnosis. And NVLD, it seems, fills the gap. It's like an extra diagnosis that these people can get so that they can still get support, because it doesn't really make any sense. If someone's got like really extreme difficulties but they just happen to lack the restricted repetitive behaviour criteria necessary for an autism diagnosis, but they're still really struggling, and they maybe don't meet the criteria for dyspraxia or ADHD or those other conditions, and they still need support, potentially an NVLD diagnosis could fill the void, and that's why some people want NVLD to enter the DSM to help these people. There is already social communication disorder, which is basically autism but minus the behavioural and repetitive, minus the restricted repetitive behaviours and interests. So it's basically a person with all the social difficulties found in autism, but they don't have enough of the restricted repetitive behaviours and interests and activities, and that's called social communication disorder. So that's already in the DSM, although I'm not sure how often it's used and what its practical efficacy is. Like, if someone gets diagnosed with that, what sort of support were they eligible for, because not many people know about that. NVLD is different to social communication disorder though, because it includes a very specific neuropsychological profile which will have a higher verbal IQ to a lower performance IQ, combined with visual spatial deficits, which is why some people call it a visual spatial learning disability, where the performance IQ is always a lot lower than verbal, sometimes extremely so. And many of these people will also have social deficits, but not all of them will fulfil the criteria for Asperger's. And those who fulfil the criteria for Asperger's, as it used to be before they got rid of Asperger's, will already be covered by the Asperger's diagnosis anyway, and NVLD would just describe their particular profile as it does for me. But for those who don't fulfil the criteria for Asperger's, they can still get diagnosed with NVLD as a separate standalone diagnosis, and that might help them. So yeah, so that's arguably one reason why they should put it in the DSM to help those people, and also why they should bring back subgroups like Asperger's, because it doesn't make sense lumping everyone into the autism spectrum, wider autism spectrum, when these people are so very, very different. I mean, if there's a very specific cause for people with NVLD type profile that's distinct from other types of autism, then we need to know about it so it can be researched and that people like me can be helped. Because like not everyone's going to have the exact profile as I have. So Asperger's syndrome then, historically, many people have argued that Asperger's syndrome contains very particular deficits in motor skills, visual spatial perception and non-verbal concept formation and visual memory. Historically, many psychologists argue that this is like the neuropsychological profile of Asperger's, which is interesting because I tick every single box for that. I'm so surprised they didn't diagnose me when I was at school, particularly as I'm a classic Asperger case. I basically had all of those symptoms combined with the social problems and the restricted repetitive behaviours, yet it took until I was 21 to be diagnosed. But like I said, I was assessed at school by an educational psychologist because they couldn't ignore the difficulties and they were pretty extreme. but no one ever suggested like a diagnosis, which is really unfair because all I got was a list of difficulties, which made me feel like a complete failure and labelled as special educational needs, and no one told me basically what it all amounted to. I was just given a list. Basically, all the features were diagnosed, such as like poor visual memory, severe visual spatial perceptual deficits, difficulties with directionality, problems with motor skills, social interaction problems. If they'd asked my parents, they would also found out about my restricted obsessive interest and all the other autism symptoms that were also present. So I was basically classic Asperger's, and that's what it describes here as well, and that was all in my report as well. So this is basically like the classic Asperger's profile, but obviously not all people with Asperger's have that profile, and I guess questions then need to be asked as to whether those people, because I guess, are there different types of Asperger's? That's the thing, there could actually be different types of Asperger's. I mean, I'm basically classic Asperger's and have it pretty severe. But obviously because I'm not a boy, and because although I did have really strong obsessive interest, I still do, they're around things like babies and dolls and like stuff that aren't considered to be like, because the classic formulation often focuses on like a boy being really obsessed with like computers or maths or something like that, which is also ironic because actually if you look at the NVLD profile, mathematical deficit is listed up there. So clearly there's a subgroup of people with Asperger's who actually, instead of being really good at maths, actually have an extreme struggle with it. Which can also be part of a classic Asperger's presentation, but no one focuses on that. They always focus on the really like mathematically able ones, which is actually only a very niche, small minority of people with Asperger's, because actually it seems to be far more common for people with Asperger's to actually struggle with maths, or maybe to be like good at some parts of it, and then struggle with other areas, and if they are good at it, it often tends to be like a really narrow part of maths as well. So those things I just mentioned are said to be very basically like the prototype of like Asperger's in terms of the neuropsychological deficits, and as I say, I have every single one of them. But it says that this profile is also very similar to the NVLD profile as described by Walk in 1995. There's like a great deal of crossover between the two. Okay, I'm going to move over to video number 2 now to carry on talking about non-verbal learning disability and its overlap with Asperger's syndrome. So moving over to video number 2.